Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth tutorial of this course, where we will be discussing different research methods you can use to answer your research questions, as well as various data collection strategies that you can hypothetically use for your projects. This will be the last pre-recorded tutorial before we meet to hear your proposal presentations next week. There will be more on that later in the tutorial though. I want to start off with some feedback regarding your second and third weekly assignments. Although it was no small feat, I tried to provide fairly extensive feedback on your literature reviews and a couple sentences more of feedback on your third assignments. This won't happen every week, but I may do it one or two more times throughout the semester. I just thought it would be helpful to receive individualized feedback early so you can think about and incorporate my comments while you're writing your actual proposals. However, this means that there is no excuse to make the same mistakes again. One thing I noticed a fair number of students' lit reviews is the splitting of the summarization of each article into a separate paragraph. Now, I never told you explicitly not to do this, so I didn't take marks off. And also, when I mean separate paragraph, I mean a paragraph with each paragraph having a heading or a title on top of it. So explicitly splitting each study into a section almost of the literature review with its own title, etc. So a literature review is meant to flow cohesively as a typical paper does. So at very minimum, you should be separating sections by actual content, not just by each article you're discussing. And using transition sentences in a way that makes sense so that your review flows from the summarization of one article into the next. At an even higher level, you should integrate summarization of multiple studies into each paragraph and transition from topic to topic, highlighting what's been found in past research, what gaps and inconsistencies still exist, why they matter, and ending with your research question that will fill said gaps. Also, I noticed a couple people didn't cite at all, which is really bad, but most students cited at the end of almost every sentence, so this is overcitation. Now, it's better to overcite than undercite for sure, just to avoid plagiarism concerns, but you don't need to do it at the end of every single sentence. As long as you cite right away in the first sentence where you discuss the article, you can only cite once or twice more throughout the same paragraph or the same time that you're discussing the article. And you don't need to cite in a sentence when you cited the sentence before, and it's really clear that you're talking about the same study in this next sentence. Finally, I didn't explicitly ask for this, but in your proposal, remember that your lit review ends with the tip of the funnel, which is your research question and your hypothesis. For assignment 3 now, make sure to review the definition of a research question versus a hypothesis. Most people were on the right track, but some still stated a research question instead of a hypothesis for the article that you summarized, your own project, or even for both sections. Remember that a hypothesis is a statement, and it specifies the relationship between your independent variable and dependent variable. So you don't just say they're going to be related, you say how they'll be related. Will the dV increase as the IV increases? Will the dV increase as the IV decreases? Vice versa. Will they both increase? So if you made this mistake, it will definitely be in your comments because I did want to let you know. Finally, a very common theme for the very last part of assignment 3 was to only provide justification or rationale for why you think your variables will be related in the way you specified, just from your own thoughts. Here, I was intending for you to revisit the literature you reviewed in the second assignment and actually cite the previous studies where the variables were related in this way. Or if the variables have not been studied together yet, perhaps find a study where similar variables were related in the same way and then use that as your rationale. I didn't take marks off for this if you did this in your assignment, but you will need to use previous research in your justification within your proposal and final project to receive full marks. And I'll discuss that a little bit more further along in this tutorial too. Moving on to the first part of today's tutorial, research design. This will be a little bit of a review of topics that were introduced in your first year psychology classes, but this information is crucial to remember when you're designing your own study. Recall that research designs can be broadly split into two categories, experimental and non-experimental designs. Each category has some unique features and comes with its own benefits and limitations, and some areas of research are pretty limited to being studied only one way, and if they're limited, this is usually because they're limited and they can only really be studied non-experimentally for a couple reasons. So focusing in on the experimental designs first, we have the true experiment, the quasi-experiment, and the single case experiment. Do you remember some of the key aspects of a true experimental design? I'll give you a couple seconds just to think about it. And if you said anything like control group, random assignment, etc., you're definitely on the right track. So most importantly, true experiments will have a control group or a group that does not receive the manipulation of the independent variable or random assignment. Random assignment is also a key feature of true experiments, where participants have an equal likelihood of getting assigned to any of the experimental conditions. And third, the IV will be manipulated actively by the experimenter. That's also a condition of true experiments. A great example of a true experiment is any randomized control trial, which are well known and sometimes referred to as gold standard research designs that are often used to investigate new medical or behavioral psychological treatments. And they're also used in health sciences and a lot of the hard sciences as well. Let's take an RCT that's investigating the efficacy of a new antipsychotic medication for an example. Patients with a diagnosis of psychosis and active symptoms will be randomly assigned to one of two groups. One group who will take the new antipsychotic and the other group will take a sugar pill placebo. And both groups will take their medication for 12 weeks. At the 12-week mark, all patients' symptoms of psychosis will be measured and the symptom levels of the two groups will be compared to see if the levels of the group who took the new medication are lower than the control or placebo groups. In the case of a true experiment, unless there is a glaring methodological issue, it could be supposed that the medication actually caused the psychosis symptoms to decrease for the experimental group, as the use of random assignment meant that each group should be more or less evenly distributed on all possibly confounding other variables, like socioeconomic status, gender, age, symptom severity, etc., etc. There are probably hundreds of confounding variables that we could think about. Quasi-experiments often look similar to a true experiment, but with less researcher control. Often, there may be no manipulation of the independent variable by the researcher, non-equivalent control group or complete absence of a control group, no control of the dependent variable, or no control over the experimental setting. Even if the experiment has just one of these things missing, it can't be said to be a true experiment. So that's control group, random assignment, and active manipulation of the independent variable. So to illustrate, it would be a quasi-experiment when a researcher recruits a sample of psychotic individuals and another sample of non-psychotic individuals and measures both groups' performance on a cognitive searching task. What are the differences between this situation and a true experiment? So for one, there was no random assignment, as one group has a diagnosis while one does not, and you can't just randomly assign. participants to have a diagnosis of psychosis or not. Further, the researcher is not manipulating the independent variable, as that is the presence of psychosis. So you can say in this case, groups are sort of self-selected. They're not choosing whether they have a diagnosis of psychosis or not, but something, a characteristic or trait that they already have is the selection criteria of which group they're going to be in. But in the researcher not manipulating this independent variable, the two groups can ultimately not be said to be equivalent on a number of third variables that could influence results, like all the ones I mentioned previously and a lot more. Next, there are single case experiments, which use a single case, which may be a person, a couple, a school, or other organization, as both the experimental and the control group. The simplest design is ABAB, which you may have heard about in your first year classes, and it's explained here too. But there are many other more complex ones. So for ABAB, first is A, or baseline, where you measure the behavior you are ultimately wanting to impact in some way before the manipulation of the independent variable even happens. Then you apply the intervention or the manipulation of the independent variable and measure the target behavior again. You then withdraw the intervention or manipulation and measure the target behavior. Does it return to baseline or close to baseline levels? So if it does, that's a good sign that your intervention was the factor that caused the behavior to change. Just to be sure, you then apply the intervention once again and see if the behavior changes again, similar to when B was first applied. These designs are used more frequently in the medical side of psychology, where the effects of a drug will wear off after a period of time, and then you can examine their effects again by re-giving the drug to the participant. I'm sure you can think of some potential issues if this was used in a type of behavioral therapy, though, or a research study for a behavioral therapy. In many cases, you can't just withdraw the intervention after it's implemented. You can't just tell participants to forget how to perform something like cognitive restructuring or another type of psychological intervention that participants learn to do themselves. So that is one of its main limitations, at least for us in psychology. So generally speaking, experimental designs, there are pros and cons of these. They typically display higher internal validity, which relates to the confidence you have as a researcher that it was actually the independent variable that caused the change in the dependent variable and not some other third variable that did it. True experiments allow for causal claims. So for example, the independent variable caused the change in the dependent variable. You absolutely cannot say this in your report if you're conducting non-experimental research, and even in quasi-experimental research, you generally can't say this either. You also have more control over the experimental design as a pro. Drawbacks to experimental designs include ethical limitations. So often there's no way to randomly assign participants on focal variables in psychology. You can't randomly assign people to have a mental illness or commit a crime or even undergo a new treatment in many cases. Sometimes there's limited external validity, which means that the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable may hold in a highly controlled research setting, but may not actually happen outside the lab in the real world. Finally, you can imagine how resource-intensive experimental designs can be, as many aspects of the experiment must be anticipated and often held constant for all participants. Let's turn now to non-experimental designs. A couple examples are correlational research, observations and case studies, and surveys, which can often be correlational too. Let's focus in on correlational research, as it's quite common in psychology. Correlational research looks for associations between two or more focal variables. You've probably already heard the mantra of researchers everywhere in your first-year courses. Correlation does not equal causation. This is why, even if it seems like two variables are associated with each other in your research project, say, if you're conducting non-experimental research, you can't really say the variation in one variable caused the variation in the other, as there is no control for possibly confounding third variables that might be in the mix. Therefore, we can't say anything about cause and effect, but we can try controlling for confounds by using fancy statistics and using special research designs, which is completely beyond the scope of this course. But still, strictly speaking, we can't draw firm cause and effect conclusions when using these designs. Here's an example of a correlational research study. A researcher wants to know whether people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia have more instances of aggression in a hospital setting. So she reviews hospital records of 100 patients and records whether they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or not. Then, for 3 months, she records the number of instances of aggression for those 100 patients and examines whether there is an association between a diagnosis of schizophrenia and more instances of aggression through statistical analyses. So, can we conclude here that schizophrenia causes more aggression? Not quite, for just a few reasons. We didn't randomly assign participants, and we couldn't, of course, and therefore we couldn't create equivalent groups, or groups that we at least know are equivalent, more or less, and therefore are much likely to have, or much less likely to have, third variable confounds such as co-occurring disorders, command hallucinations, etc. So, for example, more aggressive patients could have other co-occurring disorders, and that's the third variable, or only schizophrenic patients hearing command hallucinations are more likely to be aggressive. So in these cases, it's not the diagnosis of schizophrenia itself that's actually causing the aggression. Hypothetically, it's command hallucinations, which are a symptom of schizophrenia, but they're not the same construct. Or in number one there, it's the co-occurring disorder that's actually causing the higher levels of aggression, or the more instances of aggression, not the schizophrenia diagnosis. And then we also didn't hold the environment constant. So a vast number of environmental influences like poor treatment by staff, or staff being more likely to record an instance of aggression for a patient with schizophrenia versus one without, could also be influencing our results. Overall, correlational research speaks to associations that two or more variables display, but because we cannot hold many other factors constant across correlational designs, we cannot isolate the effects of the independent variable, so to speak, and therefore we can't speak to the causal effects of the independent variable on whatever is happening with the dependent variable that we observe in our study. Therefore, pros of non-experimental designs include fewer limitations on the research questions, since you can pretty much study anything that you want and you're not limited by needing to actually manipulate the independent variable yourself, which, as we've talked about now, it's difficult to do with some research questions. These designs can also display higher external validity, which, if you remember, means that their results may be more congruent with what is actually happening in the real world, because they have all the same influences of the real world. They're not in some, so to speak, very sterile lab environment where everything else is being controlled for. These designs can also be highly applicable to real-life issues because they look more like real life. Cons of these designs include lower internal validity, the inability to make any causal inferences, and in general, just having less control over your variables and your participants. So you're not able to say it's for sure your independent variable that caused the change in your dependent variable if a change is observed. Just before we end this section of the tutorial, I wanted to quickly touch on something that a couple of you have asked in emails to me about. I know in your assignment last week, it asked for you to identify the independent variable of one of the research articles you summarized and to explain how it was manipulated. However, researchers only actively manipulate the independent variable in true research experiments like we just discussed. If you found the task of explaining how the IV was manipulated to be difficult, it's likely that you were discussing a non-experimental design or a quasi-experimental design, as these designs are very common in psychology research. So there's a really good chance that you came across one and the study you were looking at followed one of those designs. So most of you did very well with what you were given, regardless of the confusing phrasing, and identified the independent variable correctly. For the purposes of your own research project, if you are considering conducting a quasi-experimental or non-experimental project, which is totally fine, you will likely be observing the effects of naturally occurring differences or levels of your independent variable on your dependent variable. So for example, you may be comparing one group who has a diagnosis of some mental illness versus another group who does not have a diagnosis, and comparing them on a given outcome variable, or say looking at different levels of attachment. So 3 levels, secure attachment versus anxious attachment versus avoidant attachment, and looking at the effects of those 3 levels of the independent variable on any outcome variable. If so, in today's assignment that I'll introduce at the end of the tutorial, and in your research proposal and your final report, describe the differences or levels of your independent variable instead of how you are going to actively manipulate it. Lastly, you can consider implementing a between subjects or a within subjects design. In the former, you compare 2 groups who did not receive the same manipulation or intervention or are different in another way. So for example, comparing the outcomes of those who took a new SSRI with those who got a placebo medication. In a within groups or within subjects design, you compare outcomes of the same participants over 2 or more time points. So for example, looking at the change in depressive symptoms over time in a single group by measuring depression symptoms at 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 9 weeks, etc. Think of within subjects as being similar to the single case design, but with a whole sample of participants, not just one. And because of that, you don't necessarily have to instate the manipulation or the intervention and take it away, then instate it again. Okay, so after all that, once you have a research question, a hypothesis, and a possible design to answer it in mind, you can now propose your research project. A research proposal looks a lot like a typical research article in format, but it's shorter and looks forward instead of backwards. So what I mean by this is you'll be speaking in future tense when you discuss your methods. For example, I will do this, instead of in past tense, which you will use when you write your final report, because in theory, you've already done it. Now, let's discuss some different methods of data collection, and then we'll move on to the last part of the tutorial and discuss what your final proposal, or not your final proposal, but your research proposal due this month will look like. It goes without saying that to examine the effects of your independent variable on your dependent variable, you've got to figure out how to measure the latter. How you'll decide to measure your dependent variable depends on a couple of things. You need to take into account your operationalization of the variable itself, as if you've decided to define your dependent variable of anxiety, say, by heart rate, you're not going to give your participants a self-report scale to measure it. You'll use an instrument to capture how many beats per minute their heart is going. It also depends on your research question and depends on what others in the field have done before you. So if most researchers have measured a dependent variable in a very certain way for a certain reason, you'd need a really, really good reason to buck all that tradition and go about it in a completely different way. As a researcher, you should also consider the benefits and limitations of possible methods of measurement. For the purposes of this class, it's very important that you can measure your dependent variable quantitatively. So in other words, in cold hard numbers. Many biological measures like heart rate lend themselves to this very well, and most psychological assessment tools report scores in numbers, so they're quite good too. You can also consider a dichotomous outcome, which means there are only two options. So examples of this include recidivism, so whether participants have committed a crime or not, whether participants engaged in self-harm or not, whether participants were hospitalized or not, just anything that's either this or this option. So generally speaking, there are four broad categories of data collection methods in psychology: direct observation, archival or official records, participant interviews, and surveys or psychometric tests. First, direct observation is just like it sounds, observing the behaviors, actions, or physical reactions of your participants after introducing a stimuli, so your dependent variable if you're conducting a true experiment, or in a potentially naturalistic setting, which is often if you're following a more non-experimental design. Measures of physiological response, such as heart rate, galvanic skin response, EEG, etc., would all be considered direct observation methods too. As a note though, if you're using this for measuring behaviors, you can't just say that you're going to observe your participants' behaviors and leave it at that in your methods section. While things like heart rate are very straightforward to measure with the right tools, you need a more structured way of observing and recording human behavior. For example, if you're recording how deferential a participant is to a perceived authority figure after being exposed to a certain stimulus, you would need to quantify your DV of deferential behaviors. So possibly by recording how many submissive words are used in a conversation, how many times a participant agrees to something the authority figure says, etc. But you're picking up the gist of this. That you can't just leave the construct open. You have to very firmly define it in some way that translates itself into numbers. Pros of this method include being able to capture very real representations of behavior if participants are unaware they are being observed, or if you're using a biological measure, as participants can't usually alter their heart rate on command or anything like that. However, the cons of this approach often include the ethicality of measuring participants without their knowledge. So often participants must be measured with their knowledge. If this happens, demand characteristics may often be at play. This means that human participants will often alter their behavior consciously or unconsciously while under observation to make their behavior seem more socially acceptable or desirable to the observer. So this is always something you're going to have to think about if you're planning on using direct observation along with a couple of the other methods too. Next, there is measuring your dependent variable via archival, often official records. This is data collected from a third-party source, possibly without the participant's knowledge. I'll discuss this a little more when we talk about research ethics in 2 weeks, but in some cases, such as police records, as long as you have ethical approval to access the data from the data source, so in this case, the police force and the ethical board at your university, of course, each participant doesn't necessarily need to be asked if you can access their data. In other cases, like often with hospital or other healthcare records, the participant will know and must okay you having access to their data before you get it. As I just hinted, examples of collecting data through archival records include using hospital records, police records, or students' academic grade reports. These data are often very reliable, and you can be confident that in most cases they are correct, which is great. It doesn't pose a burden on participants as they're not being asked to give up time in their day to participate, and there's no possibility of demand characteristics, especially, well, because they can't really change a grade they get in a class just by wanting to get a better grade, or if they have committed a crime or not in police reports. However, these data may be very difficult for researchers to gain access to in some cases and may underestimate certain constructs of interest. So for example, if you use official police records as a measure of recidivism, you're not capturing all the crimes that participants may have committed that were not caught by the police. So participant interviews. Here you'd be interviewing participants directly in person or maybe over the phone and collecting data from their responses. These interviews are often highly structured or semi-structured to allow easier translation into numbers for future statistical analyses and to increase reliability of measurement. Researchers may create their own protocol that is specifically tailored to their research purpose, or they could use an existing protocol like the structured clinical interview for the DSM-5. So using this method, you can gain insight into constructs that may not be captured by official records, like participants' thoughts or emotions, and capture rich and detailed data. However, this may impose a more significant time burden on both the participant and the researcher, and the participant may be untruthful in their responses, and it may be difficult to translate the data that you've collected from the participant's spoken responses into quantitative data, depending on how you've structured the interview. Lastly, you can use questionnaires or psychometric tests, which are structured sets of questions given to participants, administered via paper if you're with the participant physically, or online or over the phone. Similarly to participant interviews, researchers can develop their own questionnaire or administer an existing psychometric assessment protocol. The benefits of this approach are that it's very cost-effective, very structured, which often equates to higher reliability. There can be a relatively low burden on participants if the questionnaire is short, and it produces quantitative data quite easily. However, the data it does produce are often not as rich as other methods. Participants may be untruthful, and demand characteristics again can be at play, especially if the participant is filling out the survey while you're watching them. So depending on your research topic, a questionnaire might be a good way to consider measuring your DV for this project. As a quick note, if there is an existing measure of your DV out there, you should really consider using it. Much research has gone into validating these existing measures, so there's often more rationale for using them than just randomly deciding to make your own, because it won't have any existing research on how strong of a measurement method it really is. If you do use an existing measure, you must cite it in your proposal and describe its properties briefly in the materials section of your methods. Please ask me if you're unclear on how to do this, and I'm happy to talk about it with you. However, if you cannot find one that works for the purposes of your study, you may want to develop your own brief measure of your dependent variable. When developing it, consider what type of survey questions you want to include. There are open choice, so why do you prefer option A to option B? Closed choice, did you prefer option A to option B? And then you typically only answer yes or no. And then there's forced choice. Like respond to the following statement with agree, somewhat disagree, or disagree. One of the very common types of forced choice responses is called a Likert scale. So you've probably seen these in surveys that you've done before. There will be numbers ranging from 1 to 5, 1 to 7, or maybe 1 to 9 after you read the survey question, and they will range from strongly disagree being at one end of the scale, strongly agree will be at the other end, and then right in the middle there will be neutral or neither agree or disagree. So this is definitely an option for you to think about for using if you decide to develop your own questionnaire. While developing, you should consider some issues like response bias, lack of participant attention or effort, and lack of participant understanding. Basically, you want to make your survey as clear and easy to understand as possible. To detect participants who may be just circling choices at random or not paying attention, you can include the same question twice, but worded differently. So you can see the example on the slide there. How often do you cheat at quizzes is question 1, never, sometimes, and always. There are 3 options. And then question 12, way down more in the survey, reads, regarding cheating, how often would you estimate you cheat on quizzes? And then it says always, sometimes, and never. So you see that the responses for the participant have actually switched. Always is 0 in question 12 and never is 0 in question 1. So if a participant wasn't paying attention and just circling things, they might mess up and just circle 0 both times, but they mean completely different things. So then you can compare a participant's answers once you've got your data back on question 1 and question 12. And if they have a different answer, you know something fishy is up, as the questions were asking the exact same thing. And here are some more tips for developing a good questionnaire. You do want to group similar questions together, put open-ended questions before close-ended ones, move from the general to the specific, and leave potentially sensitive questions towards the end when the participants are feeling more comfortable. You do not want to use leading questions, loaded questions, double-barreled questions, or double negative questions. A double-barreled question is when a question touches on more than one issue but only allows for one response. So like this, please agree or disagree with this statement. Cars should be faster and safer. I've asked you if cars should be faster and if cars should be safer. So if you agree on the first and you don't agree on the second, how are you going to respond to that? It's difficult. A double negative question is when a question includes 2 negative words, making the meaning positive, but it just also makes the sentence very unclear. So for example, was the facility not unclean? That's a very weird sentence. You would ask, was the facility clean? And that would be a lot clearer. Finally, developing a questionnaire is a very tricky endeavor, and it's even tricky for a seasoned researcher. So please consult with me if you choose to do this. I'm happy to provide my thoughts on any drafts you have and just generally talk ideas over with you. Lastly, let's discuss what's expected for your actual research proposal, as it is due at the end of this month, which is coming up fast, and I hope you've started working on it. Here's the detailed rubric that explains how I'll be marking your research proposal, and I'll be sure to send these slides out tomorrow or the next day so you can save this and refer back to it. Again, your proposal is due June 28th at midnight, and it'll be worth 10 points, which will equate to 10% of your total course grade. The written portion of your proposal, so excluding the title page, references, and any appendices that you need, should be about 7 pages in length. So 3 to 4 pages for the intro/lit review, 2 to 3 for the methods, and then about 1 page for the anticipated results/prediction section, which is referred to as prediction on the grading rubric that you can see on the slide there. There is a hard limit of 10 pages for the entire proposal, including references. So this allows you to have 1 to 2 pages of references if you have 7 to 8 pages of actual content and then a title page. There may be a page minimum as well, but I haven't heard exactly what it is yet, so I don't want to tell you an exact number. However, it would shock me if a paper with less than 5 pages of actual content, so this is not including the title page or references, would achieve any sort of high mark. So at bare minimum, you do want to have at least 5 pages of actual written content as of now, but the minimum may be higher. I'll advise you of it when I hear. As you can see, you'll likely be wanting to discuss in about a paragraph or 2 why you picked your research topic. You can briefly discuss the example from daily life, similarly to how you did in the first assignment, or if it's not an example from your life in particular, you can speak more broadly as to why it's an important problem that psychology should be concerned with. However, remember to keep this formal. I cannot stress that enough. language-wise, and keep it very short, as the vast majority of your intro should be actually reviewing the relevant literature. And as you can see, the example from daily life is right at the top of the rubric there. So I could see it being a really good choice of introduction paragraph or two, just to kind of introduce your topic, introduce why it's important, and get you started. However, because it is in the rubric, you will have to include it. It's overall worth 2% of your grade. So if it's missing, then I would have to dock marks. So make sure you include it, and I would highly recommend including it as your introduction or paragraph at the beginning of your proposal. And as I've mentioned before, your intro/lit review should culminate in a statement of your research question and then your hypothesis. There should be a paragraph or two after that describing the rationale for your hypothesis. And remember, you were asked to do this for assignment 3, but many of you just talked about why you think the variables would be related in that way without referencing any actual literature. So in your proposal, I will need to see actual research cited in these 1 to 2 paragraphs of your rationale for you to get full marks in that section. The components of your research proposal will be the introduction/lit review, culminating in the aims of your study, which I'm highlighting separately because it is so important to have them, research question, hypothesis, and rationale for your stated hypothesis. Then comes your method, then your predicted results, then your references, which may be 1 or more pages, and then your appendices if you need them. Now let's break the sections of your research proposal and what's expected in each of the sections down a little bit more. Broadly speaking, the goals of your introduction are establishing the context. What's the background on this question? What's the issue more broadly? Why is it important? Reviewing what we know. So what have other studies found in this area? What are the limitations of those studies? Providing a rationale. Why your study, what will it add, why is it needed, and providing the setup for your hypothesis. Based on the literature, what do you expect to find and why, which will culminate in your statement of your hypothesis. Your introduction is mostly comprised of your literature review. So while you're writing this, review the slides or presentation from lab number 2, and this is why I'm careful to say intro/lit review always, to try and not confuse you, because it is the same thing. This shouldn't be too long. Don't rewrite whole studies that have already been done, but do highlight key points and do identify the gaps and limitations in the existing literature that make your study necessary. Introduction in a proposal is largely the same as an introduction in a finished article, but it culminates in a statement of what you want to do, not what you've done, because you haven't done it yet. And as I keep saying, your introduction should end with a statement of your research questions or question and hypothesis and rationale for them. The goal of your method section is to specify in detail how you will actually conduct your study. Think about your participants and the settings that you will recruit them from. Who will they be? Where will they come from? If you need to actively recruit them, how will you do that? What's the setting of your research study? Most importantly, how many participants will you need? For your purposes, you should look to prior research on topics very close to yours to decide how many participants you will need. Do not pick this number out of thin air and do not make it unreasonably large. So for example, we could all say that we're going to have 1,000 participants, which would definitely meet all of our needs, but we'd never get that in real life, so we do need to make this realistic. I will need to see a citation or two after you say how many participants you're hoping to have, so I know you did not pull the number out of thin air. You also want to clearly identify your variables of interest here in this section. Next, you should have a materials section and consider further splitting this into two subsections. So for your independent and dependent variables. In each subsection, how will you define and measure each of these two variables? Using what methods? If you will be using an existing measurement tool, you must include a copy of it in your appendices, and more on that in a couple of slides. You should then have a procedure section. How will you actually gather the data? How will the experiment be run? How will the participants go through the study? How will variables of interest be coded during the study, if applicable here? Of note, you will need to specify where you plan to get your data, and it needs to be realistic. This may be a particular concern for those conducting non-experimental research, as you will need to measure both an independent and dependent variable instead of manipulating your independent variable and often being able to measure your dependent variable directly following that. We can't simply pick a question and then assume we magically have the data, even if in this situation you sort of will because I'll be generating it for you. Consult with me on this. This is exactly what those bookable office hours that gives you a 15-minute appointment are for. So I'd love to see some more people making use of them, and we can talk about this. After your methods, you should devote anywhere from half a page to a page to your anticipated results. This will be similar to your actual results section, which you'll include in your final report, but here you haven't actually analyzed any data yet, and you're just discussing what you think or expect you'll find. This is a tricky section that may seem very similar to your hypothesis and rationale for it, so I'll give a few tips. You'll want to first restate your hypothesis right at the start, then perhaps restate why you think you'll find that specific relationship again. So as a reminder, this should be based on prior research, theory, etc. So it's likely that in the first couple sentences of this anticipated results section, you'll be re-summarizing parts of your hypothesis rationale paragraph or paragraphs in different wording. And remember to use different words because you can plagiarize yourself. Then you can discuss exactly what you expect to find while referencing the data analysis techniques that you'll be using. So don't worry too much about this right now. We'll talk a lot more about it before you actually have to do it. We're not expecting anything fancy, so just means, which is averages, and standard deviations or frequencies and percentages, things like that. So if you know your outcome variable / dependent variable is going to be continuous, so for example, on a scale from 0 to 40, and you're comparing two different groups on that outcome variable, you might write later in this section that you can expect group X to display a higher mean on that scale than group Y. It should be clear as to why you will expect that though, and it will be if you've restated your hypothesis and given a quick summary of your rationale for it again too. Lastly, let's briefly chat about appendices. Any written materials you plan to use to either manipulate your independent variable, so for example, a short vignette, or to measure your independent variable or your dependent variable. So for example, an existing psychometric assessment tool or a survey questionnaire you developed yourself. Any of these should be included at the end of your proposal as appendices. These pages will not count towards your page number limit, so don't worry about them, even if they're another 10 pages. You should title the first material that you include as Appendix A. So if you're just including a singular psychological assessment measure, all you have to do is just label that Appendix A and then you're good. If you're including, say, a short vignette and a psychological assessment measure, you would label the vignette Appendix A and then the assessment measure Appendix B, etc., etc. There actually is a specific way to do this in APA format, as with everything, so please look it up if you need to include appendices. And on that note, like an actual finished research manuscript for publication, your proposal does need to adhere strictly to APA 7th edition. Remember, these are rules, not suggestions. Your literature reviews that you submitted for assignment 2 more or less adhered to it, and please see my comments in Canvas on that assignment again, as I made sure to highlight your main APA issues, but also I tried to keep it relatively brief, so I didn't always highlight all of them if you had a lot. So don't think just because you attended to everything I pointed out that you're in the clear. Please just check OWL Purdue again. So this means your proposal must have in-text citations, reference pages, appropriate headers and section headings, page numbers, APA formatted title page, and just as a note, the abstract is not necessary for your proposal. That's just for your final research project. So you don't have to worry about that right now. Since I can't say this enough, please consult sources like OWL Purdue as you're writing. Please, please, please. I wanted to quickly talk about your proposal presentations as well, since they are in exactly a week from today. You should prepare a 3 to 5 minute presentation of your research proposal. Very similarly to the paper you will hand in on the 28th, your proposal presentation should include a short literature review to provide background, which should take 2 to 3 slides. Then your research question and hypothesis and the rationale behind your hypothesis, which should take 1 to 2 slides, and the proposed methods you will use to answer your research question, which should take about 2 to 3 slides. Please do not just copy and paste whole paragraphs of the paper that you're writing onto slides. Let's take your literature review for an example. A study that you summarized in a paragraph in your paper should be summarized in just a single clear sentence on your presentation slide. That way you can take the 5 studies that you reviewed and condense what they all found into 2 to 3 presentation slides with just a couple bullet points on each slide. Otherwise, it just gets way too wordy, way too heavy and hard to pay attention to. And if you're just reading your proposal, you won't have time. You won't be able to do that in 3 to 5 minutes. For your research question and hypothesis section, you can do similar. State the research question in one sentence, state the hypothesis in another sentence, then maybe farther down on the same slide or on the next slide, condense your rationale for your hypothesis, so citing existing literature, into just a couple bullet points. I will be the first to recognize that making PowerPoints is an art form that I'm still working on myself, so they don't have to be perfect. I don't expect that. But massive blocks of text with no graphics is the surest way to put your audience to sleep. Try and be familiar with Zoom screen sharing before next week as well. You'll each need to share your screen to show your presentation, and if you take 10 minutes trying to figure this out, we'll be wasting a lot of tutorial time. We might just have to skip you at that point if you can't figure it out. Also consider turning your camera on. We don't need to attend tutorial live much in this class, as tutorials are pre-recorded and asynchronous, but it would be nice to see you while you're presenting and for you to be, or for you all to be able to present to an audience of real people that you can see on camera, instead of just little black rectangles with people's names on them. I know it's quite exhausting and dehumanizing to present when everyone has their camera turned off from previous experience, so it's just good etiquette to turn your cameras on while people are presenting. As a reminder, we will be meeting live on June 16th, so next Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. PST if you're in section 105 and 10:30 a.m. PST if you're in section 106. Use the same Zoom link as for office hours. I'll send a message around the night before with it too if you don't have it handy, so don't worry about necessarily finding it now if you don't need it. And lastly, please attend and present. This will earn you an automatic 2% if you do it, as it will act as your weekly assignment. I will be giving a little feedback after every presentation, but most importantly, I will not be marking your presentations. The feedback is just for you to incorporate into your proposal paper to make it better before handing it in later. So really, this is just bonus presentation practice that will earn you marks no matter what, as long as you do it. Regardless, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone live next week. Which brings us to assignment 4, phew. First, I want you to state the hypothesis, independent variable, and dependent variable of your project. This is very similar to last week's assignment, so feel free to just pull from that or state your new hypothesis, etc., if you have revised it or changed it. Second, describe how your independent variable might be manipulated, or how you will construct different levels of it if your study is not experimental. Of note, if your independent variable is a construct you are not manipulating, so for example, you're not showing just one picture of something to one group and another picture of something to another group, you also need to specify how you will measure your independent variable. For example, if your independent variable is presence of a diagnosis of schizophrenia in one group and no diagnosis of schizophrenia in the other group, how are you going to measure whether participants have schizophrenia or not? Through an official diagnosis they already have, or will you be administering a self-report diagnostic tool yourself before assigning them to one group or the other? And then third, you will be describing how your dependent variable will be measured for your hypothesis too. So just to be very clear about my expectations for this week, questions 2 and 3 should each be about 2 paragraphs of writing, and you should provide rationale in the form of citations of previous research as to why you will be manipulating or measuring your variables in the way that you are. And of course, if you're providing in-text citations, I'll expect a reference page too in APA format. So you have a whole week to complete this, so that should give you adequate time to dive back into the literature on your topic just a little bit. To be clear about the due date, it's due right before Section 105's presentation tutorial will start. This is Wednesday, June 16th at 8:30 a.m. PST. Some students have been confused about deadlines in the past, so I hope this clears things up. Going forward, I believe you will have a week to complete most assignments. I know that Dr. Tan has said that some of you have been feeling a little stressed and pressed for time when you have to do it in 24 hours. So I think this will be the case going forward, but I will confirm at the start of each tutorial what the specific deadline for each weekly assignment is when there are weekly assignments. And that's all. As usual, I'll be on Zoom from 10 to 11 today to answer any questions you have, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all virtually next week at either 8:30 or 10:30 in the morning. See you next week.